Hi, the internet. This is Rusty Parks, and I'm going to do my first book review. This book was recommended and given to me. It's very dog-eared. It's called Feminism is for Everybody. Passionate Politics by Bell Hooks. And you'll notice that Miss Bell, who I'm assuming is this lady, based on some other pictures I've seen of her online, has a lowercase name. So if you're looking her up, lowercase. The book title itself is as well, even on the spine. However, on the back, they capitalized it. So you have to wonder if Routledge screwed that one up. What I like about the title is the use of everybody instead of everyone. Everyone would be a little more stiff-collared. And Bell appears to have tried to make a very inclusive work here that explains the feminism movement, what it was, how it affected her life going to Stanford. So let's dive right into some of my notes. Her first book, she mentions a lot in the book. She only mentions two other books that I've seen that she wrote. Her first book was Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. Written in the 70s, published in 81, she says. The quote I have here is, "Contrary to popular stereotypes, professors in women's studies classes did not and do not trash work by men. We intervene on sexist thinking by showing that women's work is often just as good, as interesting, if not more so, as work by men. So-called great literature by men is critiqued only to show the biases present in the assessment of aesthetic value." So-called. It's odd that she put so-called great literature by men in a passage where she talks about bias when critiquing aesthetic value. Pretty sure men have made actual great works. The so-called in there just seems superfluous. It would have been a great passage if not for that little jab at us man folks. That's my experience. Okay. I appear to have skipped some stuff, sorry. Okay. In Our Bodies, Ourselves, the chapter. The development of effective, though not totally safe birth control pills, created by male scientists, most of whom were not anti-sexist, truly paved the way for female sexual liberation more so than abortion rights. Women like myself, who were in our late teens when the pill was first widely available, were spared for the fear of shame of unwanted pregnancies. Responsible birth control liberated many women like myself who were pro-choice but not necessarily pro-abortion for ourselves from having to personally confront the issue. I'm sure it must have been a wild time coming up in that area. But here I found it interesting. She felt the need to put in parentheses that the birth control pills were created by male scientists, most of whom were not anti-sexist. Belle, I don't know what you're going for here. I get the feeling like she would have, and this is echoed in some other parts of the book I'll mention, I get the feeling like she would have felt better if there would have been some anti-sexist created birth control pills. And the reason I say that is there's a part where she talks about her first book being produced by this sort of socialist-owned, everybody pitches in book publisher. And she seemed very proud of it. So it seems like maybe it bothered her that the birth control pills were made by our capitalist, patriarchal society. Next, the abortion issue captured the attention of mass media because it really challenged the fundamentalist thinking of Christianity. It directly challenged the notion that a woman's reason for existence was to bear children. It called the nation's attention to the female body as no other issue could have done. It was a direct challenge to the church. Later, all the other reproductive issues that feminist thinkers called attention to were often ignored by the mass media. The long-range medical problems from cesareans and hysterectomies were not juicy subjects for the mass media. They actually called attention to a capitalist, patriarchal, male-dominated medical system that controlled women's bodies and did with them anything they wanted to do. To focus on gender injustice in those arenas would have been too radical for a mass media which remains deeply conservative and for the most part anti-feminist. Gosh, there's so much to dig into here. The medical system, she mentions more than once as being male-dominated and patriarchal and capitalist. And I think some of that rings true today. Certainly when we look at the cost of health insurance, we can see capitalism at work. I'm really not sure. Maybe people in the comments below can talk about the cesarean and hysterectomy. I guess they're referring to women who were coerced into having those. Although these days it seems like vasectomies are getting more and more popular. So we start with a point talking about how the abortion and the pill challenged Christianity and how that became a bigger issue. Pretty interesting stuff. But now hearing them talking about the media being anti-feminist, gosh, it's hard to... Lately, I feel like I've seen more people complaining that the media was anti-Trump, or pro-truth, depending on which side you're on, but the media definitely broke a couple shades bluer in 2016. Excuse me. Beauty within and without is the chapter. Nowadays, more than ever before in our nation's history, a huge number of heterosexual women past 40 were and are still single, finding themselves in competition with younger women, many of whom are not and will never be feminist. For male attention, that's what they're competing for, male attention. They often emulate sexist representations of female beauty. I guess like tube tops and hoochie skirts. I don't know what that is. Certainly, it was the interest of a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal fashion and cosmetic industry to re-glamorize sexist-defined notions of beauty. Mass media has followed suit, yada, yada, yada. So this is a phrase she uses a lot. The white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal. Whew, she should really choose like an acronym. Maybe she likes the effect of rattling off that many adjectives in a row. But, so the point here is that women who are feminists still want male attention, and in their 40s they say, well, I've been single for a long time, and here's these non-feminist women, and they kind of backslide, I guess, and go like, let's glam it up. And they set the cause back. But the notion that the the fashion industry is white supremacist, capitalist, and patriarchal. I mean, gosh. You could just say capitalist. I don't know. I'm just not. I feel like if there's money to be made in feminist makeup, somebody's going to make money in feminist makeup. Unless she's afraid that women's studies classes don't really set you up for making makeup. I don't know. I hate makeup myself. Okay, here's another passage. And this I could relate to my own life a little bit better. Girls today are often just as self-hating when it comes to their body as pre-feminist counterparts were. While feminist movement produced many types of pro-female magazines, no feminist-oriented magazine appeared to offer all-female alternative visions of beauty. Well, gee, shouldn't there be a lot of them? To criticize sexist images without offering alternatives is an incomplete intervention. Critique in and out of itself does not lead to change. Indeed, much feminist critique of beauty has merely left females confused about what a healthy choice is. As a middle-aged woman gaining more weight than ever before in my life, I want to work at shedding pounds without deploying sexist body self-hatred to do so. Nowadays in a fashion world, especially on the consumer side, where clothing that looks like it has been designed simply for reed-thin adolescent girl bodies is the norm, all females, no matter their age, are being socialized either consciously or unconsciously to have anxiety about their body, to see flesh as problematic. While we are fortunate that some stores carry beautiful clothing for women of all sizes and shapes, blah, 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 blah. So, there's some feminist magazines. They don't go far enough for Miss Bell. I can kind of relate to this, I think, because as a larger guy, I've had more than one big and tall magazine, and if anybody should have some actually fat men as models, it would be big and tall clothing magazines. But the and tall is inevitably what's going to end up being shown, because I think it just looks better in print. And this is something right from. I don't think we can blame the patriarchy on this one, Belle. I think at a certain point, people just want to find attractive people to take pictures when they're trying to sell something. Like, it sells better. I would like to see how clothes hang on an actual big man and not their 8-foot-tall basketball player, but you go in the store and you try it on, you know? That's the way the cookie crumbles. Okay, on to feminist class struggle. The voices of power feminism tend to be highlighted in mass media far more than the voices of individual feminist women who have gained class power without betraying our solidarity towards those groups without class privilege. Being true to feminist politics, our goals were and are to become economically self-sufficient and to find ways to assist other women in their efforts to better themselves economically. Our experience counter the assumption that women can only gain economically by acting in collusion with the existing capitalist patriarchy. All over this nation, individual feminists with class power who support a revolutionary vision of social change share resources and use our power to aid reforms that will improve the lives of women irrespective of class. So a power feminist here would be a woman who, I don't know, to use an example, maybe Carly Fiorina, who heads up HP and then runs for Republican presidential nominee, VP. Maybe she was never a feminist. I don't know. I don't know who these power feminists are specifically that Bell talks about, but she thinks that there's a stratification of women from the real feminists to kind of these women who use it to get ahead, and then they go, we're going to run with the big guys, try to get a CEO job. The only genuine hope of feminist liberation lies with a vision of social change which challenges class elitism. Western women have gained class power and greater gender inequality because of global white supremacist patriarchy. Boom, there it is again. Enslaves and or subordinates masses of third world women. Blah, 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 blah. Ending class welfare will create a new underclass of women and children to be abused and exploited by existing structures of domination. So I guess here we have like the issue of third world factories making clothes, which I think a lot of people are hip to. And we have kind of thrown in welfare in our own country. But saying ending welfare will create a new underclass of women and children to be abused and exploited, I thought they're already the underclass that are being abused and exploited. Ending welfare might make it worse. But that part seemed a little odd to me. So I don't know, when you read this and you think, okay, I'm going to be a woman and I'm going to be successful and a feminist, if you want to make some money, a lot of avenues are cut off to you, it seems like, in Bell's world, because inevitably you'll be aligning yourself with the patriarchy, which includes exploiting third world workers. So I'm just not sure. It would help if she mentioned some women she thought made it well and did the right thing, in the same way that we tech guys kind of appreciate Elon Musk for some of the things he's doing to the world. Give a concrete example. It's always nice. Helps me understand. We don't get one, though. Okay, in global feminism. Yet when large number of feminist activists adopted a perspective which included race, gender, class, nationality, the white power feminists, not white power feminists, but white power feminists, continued to project an image of feminism that links women's equality with imperialism. Now, I bookmarked this because she goes into some actual examples, which a lot of her talk, despite trying to make something that's easy to understand for everyone, some of her examples are light, so I tried to make notes. Global women's issues like forced female circumcision, sex clubs in Thailand, the veiling of women in Africa, India, and the Middle East and Europe, the killing of female children in China, remain important concerns. Well, I should say so. However, feminist women in the West are still struggling to decolonize feminist thinking and practice so these issues can be addressed in a manner that does not reinscribe Western imperialism. So what I hear is, I would like to go fix these things, but the only thing that's obvious would be us going in guns blazing and roughing some feathers, or sanctions, tariffs, other things the patriarchy's done for a while. So it's almost like, well, we can't move forward on this because feminist theory hasn't figured out how to actually do that yet. When I read stuff like this, I get a little bit disheartened with the whole theory of it, because we've presented usually these countries are depicted as barbaric and uncivilized. The sexism there portrayed as more brutal and dangerous to women than sexism here in the United States. Well, if women are getting circumcised over there but not here, it would be more brutal and dangerous. But it seems like she doesn't want to give up that. Although, To me, it's an easy argument. A decolonized feminist perspective would first and foremost examine how sexist practices in relation to women's bodies globally are linked. For example, linking circumcision with life-threatening eating disorders, which are the direct consequence of imposing thinness as a beauty ideal. I don't get how conflating female circumcision with anorexia and bulimia in the U.S. is going to... I don't get how that perspective is useful for dealing with the issue of female circumcision. It's a perspective. Unless the perspective has gotten over there where they're doing it. I don't get it, Bill. I just don't get it. Okay, women at work, where we talk about women going back into the workforce. We skipped a bit here, but she kind of jumped straight into a defense, saying women are wrong to blame feminism for making it so they have to work, which is what many women think. The truth remains that consumer capitalism was the force leading many women into the workforce. Citation not given. One force leading women into the workforce was some of the world wars where women, Rosie the Riveter and all that, had to work. I'm sure capitalism didn't help. But the issue here is I think some feminists remember families surviving and being happy on a single income, and now that's not really the reality. Women are working more and more, but and she goes into this, how the housework isn't necessarily equitable after that, and women are kind of more miserable afterwards than they were before. She mentions that women got self-esteem from entering the workforce, that it was isolated and lonely and depressing working inside the home, and while workers don't feel secure in a factory, they're at least part of a team who's trying to deal with it. When men did most of the work, women worked to make home a site of comfort and relaxation for males. Home was relaxing to women only when men and children were not present. Well, you got 9 hours a day, so I don't know. I just don't know. When women in the home spend all their time attending to the needs of others, home is the workplace for her, not a site of relaxation, comfort, and pleasure. Well, that's a good point, Belle. I guess the idea is that you see it, you're not coming home. You're already there. But she does say here, women have not been able to find any satisfying work, and their participation in the workforce has diminished the quality of their life at home. Has diminished their quality of life at home. So she spends like a whole giant paragraph talking about how their life at home sucked, and then they said, well, actually, for most women, it's kind of worse at home now. She just does her best to undermine some of her own points sometimes. And I guess the point is it's still a journey and a problem for women to work, come home and be happy. Like, I get that. It sucks. But it just doesn't... Like, if you were going to write a self-help book on, like, how to lose weight, you're like, hey, this guy did this thing and he lost some weight and he's happy. But this book is like the opposite of that. It's like, hey, we're feminists and we did this stuff and things still like really suck and patriarchy's still going strong. I guess you're kind of reading it from the middle. But it just kind of reads differently. It's not really making you super confident that it's going to solve all your problems. Anywhere in the book does it make you feel that way. But it's for everybody. Okay, poverty has become a central women's issue. White supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal attempts to dismantle the welfare system in our society will deprive poor and indigent women of access to even the most basic necessities of life. Blah, 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 blah. And the idea is that we try to go back to a male-dominated household and the man pays for everything. Okay, there is no feminist agenda in place to offer women a way out, a way to rethink work. That's kind of a big deal. But get on that. Since the cost of living in our society is high, work does not lead to economic self-sufficiency for most workers, women included. Yet economic self-sufficiency is needed if all women are to be free to choose against male domination and to be fully self-actualized. So you kind of got to work the capitalist game from within. It's hard to defeat the patriarchy when you got to find meaningful work in the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy to make a living to do so. A little bit later, teachers and service workers in all areas need to be paid more. Women and men who want to stay home and raise children should have wages subsidized by the state, as well as the homeschool programs that will enable them to finish high school and work on a graduate degree. So here's where we get into the actual nut of it, is the idea that the state should pay people to go back to school. It's in short, feminism is socialism. The book makes it very clear it can't live with capitalism. You can't expect everybody to work or find a spouse that's going to work or work it out with their spouse. You need state subsidies because there is no, let's reread that, no feminist agenda in place of offering women a way out, a way to rethink work. So we need a state agenda. So that's part of the goal. So she says you should be able to go to college by watching like videos and stuff. This was written a little bit before the internet really took off, I think. If welfare, not warfare, military spending was sanctioned by our government and all citizens legally had access to a year or two of their lives during which they received state aid and were unable to find a job, which we saw a little bit of that when everybody got laid off, like 2 years of unemployment. We did see that. The negative stigma attached to welfare programs would no longer exist. If men had equal access to welfare, they would no longer carry the stigma of gender. So she's saying here that men are at a disadvantage to getting welfare. No footnotes, though, so I'll take her word for it. 30 years ago, contemporary feminists did not foresee changes that would happen in the world of work in our society. They did not realize that mass unemployment would become more of the norm. Liberal assault on welfare, blah, 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 blah. So the feminism as seen by her is the welfare state. It is socialism. But at the end of the day, even with welfare and socialism, the way she's talking about it, it seems to me like, I don't know, like you still have these capitalist companies running everything. We don't really get any kind of way out of that. Like even if they go back to school, it's going to be to work at some big company, which is part of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So I don't see how that's going to help anything. In Race and Gender, the chapter. We knew that there could be no real sisterhood between white women and women of color if white women were not able to divest of white supremacy, if feminist movement were not fundamentally anti-racist. So, in Race and Gender, she mentions that feminism and race issues are connected because the sisterhood, which is a big theme in the feminist movement, and I've had to gloss over a lot of this obviously, but sisterhood was when all sorts of women would come together and discuss their problems, and it was a big part of creating feminist theory, getting it off the ground, were these sessions. Kind of like an AA meeting, the way she described it. But she makes the case that, right here, For years I witnessed the reluctance of white feminist thinkers to acknowledge the importance of race. I witnessed their refusal to divest of white supremacy, their unwillingness to acknowledge an anti-racist feminist movement was the only political foundation that would make sisterhood a reality. So, here she is going to Stanford, going to the sisterhood meetings, and this is the way I see it. They're talking about feminism, and she's saying, well, I think race is an issue. A lot of people aren't ready for that yet, and she's kind of saying, yes, it is. And you'll see why that's important later when we start talking about gay and lesbian issues. That I bring that up because, but I will also say on a side note, she says white supremacist so much in this book that it almost, like when we had Steve Bannon taking off and everyone's calling him a white supremacist, and he'd worked at Goldman Sachs and Breitbart and all that, it almost just seems like from this book, any white guy that's like a CEO of anything is probably like de facto white supremacist. It kind of declaws the whole term a little bit, or it just, I mean, she uses it about everything. Everything is white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchy, boom, boom, boom. There almost needs to be a stronger term for if you want to call out somebody for being actually overtly racist and not just a member of the current status quo. I don't know. Ending violence. What she never says in this chapter on ending violence, she talks a lot about violence against kids, and eventually you figure out she's just talking about people who whip their kids. But for a book that's written to be clear by everybody, she doesn't just come out and say whip their kids. She says a huge majority of parents use some form of physical or verbal aggression against children. Since women remain the primary caregivers of children, the facts confirm the reality that a given hierarchical system and a culture of domination which empowers females, like the parent-child relationship, all too often use coercive force to maintain dominance. So women whip their kids, probably even more than men do, according to her. And that's all part of the same kind of system of dominance that teaches, I guess, adults that it's okay to use violence to control each other, she says. I thought that was an interesting point, that there's an anti-spanking agenda here is a part of feminism. I didn't know that, but I guess it makes sense. So, tragically, we are witnessing a resurgence of harmful misogyny assumptions that mothers cannot raise healthy sons, that boys benefit from patriarchal militaristic notions of masculinity which emphasize discipline and obedience to authority. Boys need healthy self-esteem, they need love, and a wise and loving feminist politics can provide the only foundation to save the lives of male children. Patriarchy will not heal them. If that were so, they would already be well. Well, I'm coming from a point of view that taking football and karate and other masculinizing activities really did save me. Got picked on a lot. Like, love wasn't just going to love me through that. Just disagree 100%. Boys do benefit from karate, football, Boy Scouts, discipline. There's no studies mentioned here, probably because there are no such feminist systems that she is claiming will help boys to study, and because she doesn't mention any kind of study. Further down, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is not able to provide all it is promised. Many men are anguished because they did not engage in liberating critiques that could enable them to face these promises that these promises were rooted in injustice and dominations, and even when fulfilled, have never led men to glory. Bashing liberation while reinscribing white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal ways of thinking that have murdered their souls in the first place, they are just as lost as many boys. I just wish she would have gone into it. I mean, I would assume she's talking about stuff like football, sports, martial arts, boxing. Maybe I need a group to understand all the ways that I've been indoctrinated with all of this. I'm not bashing liberation. I don't understand how you feel I need to be liberated. And I read your book. Feminism is for everybody, including me, and I still don't get it. You didn't. Maybe I'm dense. I can guarantee you I'm dense, but maybe somebody can explain it to me in the comments. Feminist parenting. I'm a parent, so this applies to me as well. Conservative pundits have responded to a wellspring of violent acts by young males of all classes and races by suggesting that single women cannot possibly raise a healthy male child. This is just simply not true. The facts show that some of the most loving and powerful men in our society were raised by single mothers. Again, it must be reiterated that most people assume that a woman raising a child alone, especially sons, will fail to teach a male how to become a patriarchal male. This is simply not the case. Within white supremacist capitalist patriarchal cultures of domination, children do not have rights. They will come and take your kids. Kids have a lot of rights. You don't feed your kids, clothe your kids, like CPS or DPS will come and take your kids. Kids very much have rights. I do agree that a single mother can raise boys, but when she says the facts show that some of the most loving and powerful men in our society were raised by single mothers, she doesn't mention any of them. Once again, no footnotes in the book. They exist, I'm sure, but she doesn't mention them. We can't check up and see if they had strong male mentors, like what hoops those mothers jumped through to make sure their men were well-rounded. I think we could probably respect all the work that they put into raising those boys into men, and it probably involved some male mentors at some point. It probably did. But we don't know, because we don't know. Just the facts show. Later on. Problematically, for the most part, feminist thinkers have never wanted to call attention to the reality that women are often the primary culprits in everyday violence against children. You get the feeling like her mom really worked her over, because she mentions this a lot. Like, she must have known somebody that really took it to their kids hard. But she insists that women are big perpetrators of violence against children. Often I tell the story of being at a fancy dinner party where a woman is describing the way she disciplines her young son by pinching him hard, clamping down on his little flesh for as long as it takes to control him, and how everyone applauded her willingness to be a disciplinarian. I shared an awareness that her behavior, I shared the awareness, I like that her behavior was abusive, that she was potentially planting the seeds for this male child to grow up and be abusive to women. Significantly, I told the audience of listeners that if we had heard a man telling us of how he just clamps down on a woman's flesh, pinching her hard to control her behavior, it would have been immediately acknowledged as abusive. Yet, when a child is being hurt from this form of negative domination, it's condoned. It's interesting because, first of all, I bet the dinner party real. You do see this. There's inevitably some Facebook video that'll come out where a mom sees her kid doing something dumb, and this is typically an African American mother, and there'll be many varieties of this, and her kid is some thug, and she goes and beats him with her purse or something, and everyone applauds her and goes, that's what we need. And it does kind of put forth this rhetoric that the reason we have these problems isn't that society is failing these young black men, it's that their mothers aren't beating them thoroughly enough. So I think she's onto something here. But boy, did she ruin that dinner party. But she also admits here that, like, people see if a man were bragging about pinching his wife to control her, that it would immediately be seen as abusive. But it's kind of admitting that we've kind of come pretty far. Like, even men who aren't feminists know that you don't pinch your wife to control them. Like, she knows this. This will come up later in feminist parenting. At the beginning of the feminist movement, feminists were harsh critics of mothering. Jerks. Pitting that task against careers that were deemed more liberating, more self-affirming. However, as early mid-'80s, some feminist thinkers were challenging feminist devaluation of motherhood and the overvaluation of work outside the home. So it is interesting that, and maybe it's the difference Bell Hooks has from other feminists, but we've put working on this high pedestal above raising children. But working is still being a part of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, whereas raising good kids is something that we need to be doing anyway. So you have to wonder, I guess it was just a knee-jerk reaction to saying you can't work, you can't do what men do. But there's a conflict of interest there, right? I think she is highly critical of some of the early feminist thoughts, and we'll see some more of that later where I flagged it, because I thought it was interesting. She certainly doesn't kowtow to other feminist things. She is her own woman. This is from her previous book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. Working within a social context where sexism is the norm, there is an unnecessary competition promoting envy, distrust, antagonism, and malice between individuals. Makes work stressful, frustrating, and often totally unsatisfying. Many women who like to enjoy the wage work they do feel it takes too much of their time, leaving little space for satisfying pursuits. While work may help women gain a degree of financial independence or even financial self-sufficiency, for most women it is not adequately fulfilled human need. As a consequence, women's search for fulfilling labor done in an environment of care has to be re-emphasizing the importance of family and the positive aspects of motherhood. So, yeah. Good point, Belle. In Liberating Marriage and Partnership, early on feminist activists focused so much on private bonds and domestic relationships because it was in those circumstances that women of all classes and races felt the brunt of male domination. Whether from patriarchal parents or spouses. A woman might assertively challenge a sexist male boss or stranger's attempt to dominate her, then go home and submit to her partner. Contemporary feminists, both those of heterosexual women who come from long-term marriages and lesbian allies in struggle, critiqued marriage as yet another form of sexual slavery. They highlighted the way traditionally sexist bonds led to marriages where elements of intimacy, care, and respect were sacrificed so that men could be on top. Could be the patriarchs ruling the roost. Early on, many feminist women were pessimistic about men changing. Some heterosexual women decided that they would choose celibacy or lesbianism over seeking after unequal relationships with sexist men. Others saw that sexual monogamy with men as reinforcing the idea that the female body was property belonging to the individual male she was bonded with. We chose non-monogamous relationships and refused to marry. The thing that I found most interesting here was just that these women were afraid to get married and were, according to her, choosing lesbianism. And I think it's odd in this book because a lot of the progress was made in gay acceptance, was saying, hey, we were born this way. We were born with these urges. We can't just choose who to love, who to marry. And then here she is saying, no, these feminists totally just chose lesbianism because they thought being with any man, either they couldn't find a non-sexist man or being monogamous with any man at the very least. Like, if you are going to go with men, you have to go with a lot of them to show that one of them doesn't own you. I think early feminism sounds like a pretty unhealthy way to go after relationships, to me. When it came to sexual freedom, this is later, women made great strides. The critique of monogamy has been forgotten as the prevalence of stuff like AIDS. Came up. So she mentioned that the monogamy kind of got encouraged by the AIDS epidemic. She made this point that I thought was interesting because I didn't get it. While women will freely choose to have sex with a man who is partnered with another woman, men will often show no sexual interest in a woman who is partnered, or they will continually concede power to the male that the woman is partnered with, even going so far as to seek his approval of their involvement. I don't know. I think if someone's got a partner, you leave that alone. That's like a good thing. But I made a note here about Eskimo brothers because you can look it up. That's also a thing, Bill. You didn't talk about Eskimo brothers. Later. The absence of children made it easier to be peers simply because of the way in which patriarchal society automatically assumes certain tasks will be done by mothers and almost always makes it harder for women to achieve gender equity around childcare. For example, it is very telling that in the wake of feminist movement of patriarchal medical establishment, which had previously downplayed breastfeeding, suddenly began to not only be positive about breastfeeding, but insistent. And later she says that many women in relationships with males often found that having a newborn baby plummeted their relationships back into more sexist defined roles. And I underline sexist defined roles here because breastfeeding is a sex defined role, not a sexist defined role. You're just complaining about anatomy here. Men can't breastfeed. It's like she's mad that women end up having to do certain of these, but we could look at some real examples like, hey, men can change diapers, but to attack the science behind breastfeeding as like medical science just decided to, there's just a distrust for the science behind breastfeeding, which has only grown in strength. And why did the we probably needed to make formula because some women couldn't breastfeed. Like, that was for women's benefit. And then the promotion of breastfeeding when it's possible is for the baby's benefit because it helps their immune systems. But this is seen as being a product of the patriarchal medical establishment. I just don't buy it. Like, we're slamming doctors here for getting behind the science of what makes babies healthy and calling it sexist just because women have to do it. It's just bizarre to me. I'm sure childbirth would be sexist if she could make the case. But the central point is true that it's easier when you don't have children to kind of aim for the equal marriage thing. But there's something about having a kid that moms take on certain roles and dads take on certain roles. That's true. But there's just some of the bits how she talks about it I just found interesting. Okay. A feminist sexual politic. Feminist sexual freedom requires dependable, safe birth control, she wrote. Feminist sexual freedom also requires knowledge of one's own body and understanding of the meaning of sexual integrity. Early feminist activism around sexuality focused so much attention on the politics of granting females, the right to be sexual whenever we wanted to be, with whomever we wanted to be sexual with, that there was little feminist education for critical consciousness, teaching us how to respect our body in an anti-sexist way, teaching us what liberatory sex might look like. Well, I would just like to think that just sleeping with as many people as you can might not be the best thing in general for your soul. Maybe looking for a real connection with someone before you just go for it might be good for a lot of people's psyches. Love is a thing. In the late 60s, early 70s, women were often encouraged to make synonymous sexual freedom with sexual promiscuity. In those days, and to some extent in the present, most heterosexual men saw and see sexually liberated female as one who will be sexual with the least amount of fuss, asserting no demands, particularly emotional ones. So, feminists got a reputation for being loose. Like they wouldn't try to get a relationship with you. That seems counterproductive to what they were going for to me. To get that kind of, but I guess it's natural. Like if your whole deal is I'm going to have as many partners as I can. Men are opportunistic and they're like, hey, here's these women who want to have a lot of sexual partners. That's good for me because I want to sleep with anyone. So, I don't know. Yet another example of the movement working against its own self-interest. Individual women who moved from having relationships with men to choosing women, there's the word choice, choosing again, because they were seduced by the popular slogan, feminism is the theory, lesbianism the practice, soon found that these relationships were emotionally demanding and fraught with difficulty as any other. She makes the point that lesbian relationships still kind of had a dominant submissive side to it, which was functionally equivalent to the problems that were with straight relationships. But this passage reminded me of a news thing that some of my feminist women friends were rebelling against, that in which they said that feminists were all some derogatory word meaning lesbians. But at least according to Bell, at the onset, lesbianism was a big part of it for a lot of people. So it's apparently not a totally unfair generalization. Radical lesbians who had once been the lone voices calling women on account of sleeping with the enemy were now joined by heterosexual women who were choosing same-sex bonds because they were utterly disillusioned with men. Suddenly the discourse on sexuality, potentially all discussion on intercourse that emerged, made it seem that all coitus was sexual coercion, that any penetration of the female by the male was rape. Yeah, she kind of echoes a lot of concerns we've had now with the whole yes means yes movement. That feminism makes it increasingly hard to come up with a realistic way of propositioning a woman. I don't know how to say it. She says it here. It's, when you're in a world where anything a man does is considered rape, of course we get an anti-feminist movement. Like, you're putting men in a really tight hallway here. Many of these young women ended up choosing bisexual practice or choosing relationships with men where it was agreed that a female partner would determine the nature of all sexual encounter. However, masses of young females simply turned away from feminist thinking, and in this found their way back to outmoded sexist notions of sexual freedom and embraced them at times with a vengeance. So, feminism leads to what Bell is saying here. The woman makes all decisions and all choices in the encounter. So this isn't a situation where men and women are on equal footing. The woman's, by her own admission, calling all the shots. So she goes on here to say that men liked getting with women because they were liberal sexually. But what happened, she said, is often when that happened, heterosexual men made it clear that they would need to look elsewhere for a sexual release, and that's when these women decided that they didn't want to be sexual. And then she says, an action which reinforced the reality of continual allegiance to a sexual paradigm of ownership in the female body, as well as their holding to the notion that any female body would suffice. It's really hard. Bell says, if a woman wants multiple partners, that's fine. Don't settle down with the man. If a man wants to be one of those partners with the woman, that's fine. But if he threatens to go have another partner because his appetite isn't filled, then that's reinforcing, what does she put? Reinforce the reality of the continued allegiance to the sexist paradigm of ownership. I fail to not see how we're not putting a double standard up here. I don't get it at all, Bell. In a world where positive expressions of sexual longing connect us, we will all be free to choose those sexual practices which affirm and nurture our growth. Promiscuity to celibacy just depends on whatever you want. I don't think we arrived at an answer here. Honestly, when you read through some of these chapters on women who felt like they were being pressured into lesbianism, or they weren't a real feminist, to trouble with having multiple partners, it makes plain old monogamy look pretty good, in my opinion. In Total Bliss. And sorry, the full chapter name was Total Bliss, Lesbianism and Feminism. So this continues the theme that the two go hand in hand. In those days, there was pressure on some of us to prove we were really radically down with the movement by sharing our politics and our bodies with women. I fail to see how a movement about women having control of their own body involves pressuring women to have sex with a type of partner that they don't want to have sex with to prove that they're down. A lot of this seems really jacked up to me. Okay, so one other note here is she was accused of being homophobic because there was no discussion of lesbianism in her first book, that the absence was an indication of homophobia. She did not want to talk about sexuality in the book. She wasn't ready. And had I known more, I would have stated that, so no one would have been able to label me homophobic. So it's important to her that she not be labeled that way. She doesn't like labels like homophobic, but she's fine calling most of society white, supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And I also mentioned this, that she didn't put lesbianism in her first book because she mentions and was totally judgmental earlier several times against women who didn't want to make race an issue in feminism. But her being a black woman, of course, race is important. So for this black woman who is a lesbian who confronts her, of course, that's an important issue. But she should extend understanding to other people who are trying to be feminists, but maybe the race issue isn't something they're ready to deal with yet. It's just funny to me. Like, but here we get the what's called third wave feminism now, where the gay and lesbian rights, race, and women's issues are all part of feminism. But more and more you hear like, hey, if you're not feminist, you don't think women should have the same rights as men. But we see again and again in a book, like it's more than just women's rights. It's a whole grab bag of issues that are loosely tied together, but which all affect sisterhood, as she puts it. That was my biggest takeaway from the book. Something that I feel is still misunderstood. Later she writes, if any female feels she needs anything beyond herself to legitimate and validate her existence, she is already giving away her power to be self-defining, her agency. I think that's great. I think that's a really great quote. I know I've been harping a lot an hour into this, that shared some stuff I didn't agree with, but that was a good line. We're nearly done here. To love again, the heart of feminism. If a woman and man want to know love, they have to yearn for feminism. For without feminist thinking and practice, we lack the foundation to create loving bonds. Well, Belle, feminism kind of got to start, and I read some of the earliest stuff at the turn of the 1900s. In French, Irigaray, I really feel like there was love and perfectly fine heterosexual relationships before the foundations of feminist thinking. So agree to disagree. We could have just said, here's some stuff that we think feminists teach that could help your marriage, and I would be down, but sometimes she really makes some strong claims here. And the book is full of cases where feminism just still doesn't work in our society. And then she's like, well, you need this if you want a loving bond with your partner. She wrote here, I still wanted the love of a good man, and I still believed I could find love. However, I was absolutely certain that the first man had to be committed to feminist politics. In the early 70s, women who wanted to be with men faced the challenge of converting men to feminist thinking. If they were not feminist, we knew there would be no lasting happiness. Romantic love, as most people understand it in patriarchal culture, makes one unaware, renders one powerless and out of control. So, it's been said a lot since this book, but you shouldn't go looking for a guy and try to change him. I'm sure there were some men that were feminists then. Maybe Belle found one. I'm not sure. We should look that up on Wikipedia, see if she found her guy or not. And feminist spirituality, and this is the last quote I have. The private nature of this soul-searching often means that the public is not informed about the degree to which feminist activists now acknowledge fully the necessity of attending needs of the spirit. This is because pretty much every religion she mentions earlier in the chapter is also part of the patriarchy. So, I don't know, maybe some of the newer, more liberal-leaning branches of Christianity satisfied her, but it's like spirituality like so many other things in the book, is something that didn't really jive with feminism, but they still needed some degree of spirituality to feel plugged in. So, I guess my review would be that it is a fascinating read, but it left me no more a feminist than I started. I feel that it doesn't really. It's more of a historical piece explaining a brief history of feminism would have been a much more accurate title, I think. But I don't know. This has been the first book review, and thanks for your time. I'm going to sign out now. Bye-bye.